The night Thomas Hale sent the letter, the temperature had dropped to 11 degrees, and the wind was pushing hard off the fields from the northwest, rattling the shutters of the farmhouse in a way that made the place sound emptier than it actually was. He had been sitting at the kitchen table for 2 hours with nothing but a lamp, a cold cup of coffee, and the particular grinding quality of silence that settles into a house when no one has laughed in it for a very long time. The letter from the Hartwell Correspondence Agency had arrived that morning, forwarded by his cousin in Columbus, who thought it might give him something to think about. It described their services in careful, dignified language and enclosed a one-page questionnaire. Thomas had read it twice, set it on the table, gone out to check the horses, come back in, read it a third time, and then, in a mood he would later describe to himself only as temporarily irrational, filled it out. He wrote down his age, 34, his occupation, cattle and grain farmer, his acreage, 260, and in the space marked personal qualities he wrote, after a pause, honest, punctual, and unlikely to cause drama, which was not exactly a romantic advertisement but was at least accurate. In the space marked what are you seeking in a companion, he wrote someone who does not mind silence and means it, because it was November and the lamplight was yellow, and he had been alone long enough that honesty felt easier than performance. He sealed the envelope before he could reconsider, walked it to the end of the drive in the 11-degree dark, and put it in the postbox with the flag up. Then he went inside, finished the cold coffee, and went to bed, fully expecting never to hear anything back. The agency wrote to him in 3 weeks. They had a match. Her name was Margaret Avery, age 29, from a small town in eastern Pennsylvania. She had read his questionnaire, including the part about silence, and written back that she found it the most honest thing she had seen from the agency in 6 months of looking. She was willing to correspond. Thomas stared at the letter for a long time, and then wrote back because it seemed rude not to. That exchange of letters lasted 2 months and managed, without either of them entirely intending it, to become something he looked forward to with an intensity that unsettled him considerably. When she wrote that she was prepared to come to Mill Haven if the arrangement still stood, Thomas sat down and reread every letter she had sent him, looking for the part where he had implied it was a joke. He could not find it. He wrote back and said the arrangement still stood and that he would meet her at the station. He put the letter in the post box and stood in the cold for a moment longer than necessary, looking out at his 260 acres of frost-covered Ohio farmland, and wondered with genuine uncertainty what exactly he had set in motion. The station at Mill Haven was not built for drama. It was a practical, plain-faced building of red brick and white trim that served primarily as a waypoint for grain shipments and the occasional traveling merchant, and the townspeople who gathered near it on the morning of Margaret Avery's arrival were doing so with a very particular energy of people who had told themselves they were just passing through, but had somehow all arrived at the same time. Word had traveled, as word always does in a town of 1,100, and the news that Thomas Hale, who had not had a single guest at his farmhouse in the 3 years since his mother passed, had sent for a bride had been discussed in the general store, the feed merchant, the church vestibule, and at least 2 kitchen tables with a kind of intensity usually reserved for weather and local elections. Thomas stood apart from all of it, hat in hand, watching the train slow into the station with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is now standing directly inside its consequences. He had told no one about the arrangement except his neighbor Gus, who had responded with a silence so long and so weighted that it constituted an entire opinion. The people gathered on the platform were not there at his invitation. They were there because Mill Haven, Ohio in 1883 was a town that paid close attention to its own business and could not reasonably be expected to overlook something this interesting. Margaret Avery stepped off the second car with a leather trunk and a canvas bag over one shoulder, wearing a dark wool traveling coat and a plain hat with no ornamentation, and she looked at the crowd on the platform with an expression of such complete, composed calm that several people later mentioned it specifically when recounting the morning. She was not flustered. She was not nervous. She looked at the assembled townspeople the way a person looks at a familiar situation they have thought about in advance and prepared for accordingly. Then she looked past them, found Thomas in about 4 seconds, and walked directly to him as though the crowd between them was not particularly relevant. She said his name as a statement, not a question. He said hers the same way. They shook hands, which struck at least 3 observers as remarkable in some way they could not immediately articulate. Thomas took her trunk, and she kept the canvas bag, and they walked to the wagon, and the entire crowd watched them go with the concentrated, unspoken attention of people who have just seen the first scene of something they intend to follow very closely. In the wagon, before he had said more than 4 words, she turned to him and said she wanted to be straightforward with him about something before they reached the farm. Thomas tightened his hands on the reins and said she should go ahead. She said that she had a reason for coming to Millhaven that had nothing to do with the agency. Then she looked at the road ahead and said nothing more. The farmhouse was larger than she had expected. Not grand. Nothing about Thomas Hale suggested grand, but solid and considered, built in stages over 2 generations, with additions that spoke of a family that had kept growing until, for reasons she did not yet know, it had stopped. The kitchen was clean in the way a man's kitchen is clean when he has developed a system and adheres to it rigorously. The main room had a fireplace, 3 chairs, and a shelf of books that surprised her. She ran her eye along the spines while he set down her trunk and named their titles internally. 2 surveying manuals, a Bible worn soft at the cover, a collected volume of Emerson, a practical guide to grain yields, and tucked at the end with its spine slightly faded, a novel she recognized. Her room was at the end of the hall, past a closed door that he indicated with the faintest hesitation before moving past it. The room had a window that faced east over the frost-pale fields, a narrow bed with a wool quilt and a double wedding ring pattern, a small writing desk, and a hook on the wall for her coat. It was spare, and it was clean, and it felt like a space that had been prepared with more care than he was going to acknowledge. She set down her canvas bag on the desk and stood for a moment looking out the east window at the flat winter-gray Ohio fields. Somewhere on the property, a horse moved in its paddock. The wind pressed against the glass. She opened the canvas bag and removed, with the careful deliberateness of someone managing something fragile, a small wrapped bundle, which she placed in the bottom drawer of the desk without unwrapping it. Then she closed the drawer and went to help with supper. Thomas had started a pot of something practical and was cutting bread when she came in. They worked around each other in the kitchen with a careful spatial awareness of 2 people learning the geometry of a shared space, and it went more naturally than either of them had braced for. Over supper, he asked about her journey. She answered in full sentences. He asked about Pennsylvania. She described it without sentimentality. Then she asked him how long he had owned the farm, and his answer was the longest thing he had said to anyone in 6 months. They sat with that for a moment afterward, both of them noticing it. Before she went to bed, she asked, with a directness he was already coming to recognize as simply her natural register, whether the closed door in the hallway was something she should know about or something she should leave alone. He was quiet for a beat. Then he said she should leave it alone for now. She nodded and said good night and walked down the hall, and Thomas sat in the kitchen for another hour listening to the wind and thinking about the ways she had said for now back to him like a mirror. By Thursday, Millhaven had developed 2 competing theories about Margaret Avery. The first, held primarily by the women who gathered at the dry goods counter on weekday mornings, was that she was hiding something unfortunate from her past, a failed prior engagement, a financial disgrace, a family scandal, and that Thomas Hale, in his characteristic obliviousness to social signals, had invited it directly into his house. The second theory, argued with more energy but less evidence, was that Thomas had finally done something sensible, and that anyone criticizing the arrangement was simply annoyed at having been surprised. Neither theory had yet encountered Margaret directly, which was the problem. She came into town on Thursday morning to visit the post office, and the post office was run by a meticulous man named Mr. Aldous who had, in 22 years of service, developed the ability to make a person feel assessed and evaluated while appearing merely to sort envelopes. Margaret handed him a letter to be mailed, accepted her receipt, thanked him precisely, and walked out. He later reported that she had given absolutely nothing away, which the dry goods counter found deeply suspicious, and Edna Marsh, who ran the millinery 2 doors down, found deeply impressive. Thomas came into town the same afternoon for grain supplies and was intercepted by his neighbor Gus within 30 seconds of dismounting. Gus wanted to know how it was going. Thomas said fine. Gus asked whether she was what he expected. Thomas said she was not what he expected at all, but said it in a tone that Gus, who had known him for 20 years, understood to mean something considerably more positive than the word suggested. Gus said that was probably good. Thomas agreed it was probably good and bought his grain. That evening, Margaret made supper from the stores in the larder with a quiet competence that made him feel, strangely, that the kitchen had been waiting for someone to use it properly. After eating, she asked him, without preamble, whether there was a land records office in Millhaven. He said there was at the county courthouse, open weekday mornings. She thanked him and asked nothing further. He wanted very much to ask why she needed the land records office and said nothing, because he had a strong instinct that the answer was connected to the thing she had started to tell him in the wagon on the first morning and then stopped, and that she would tell him the rest when she was ready and not a moment before. He was right about that. What he could not have guessed was how much the answer was going to reorder everything he thought he knew about the land his grandfather had left him. The land records office was staffed by a young clerk named Fenwick, who had the organized, slightly anxious energy of someone who took great pride in a filing system that no one else fully understood. Margaret arrived at 9 in the morning with a small notebook and a request for surveying records from the 1840s covering the eastern section of Millhaven Township. Fenwick looked at her, looked at the request, and said those records were archived and would take some time to locate. She said she would wait and sat in the wooden chair beside the window with her notebook open and her hands folded over it, and the specific patience of a person who has been waiting a long time already and is accustomed to it. The records took 40 minutes. They were 3 large folded survey maps, coffee-colored with age, and a bound ledger of property transactions going back to the township's original platting. Margaret spread the first map on the reading table with careful hands and studied it for a long time. She wrote several things in her notebook. She asked Fenwick about one particular parcel in the northeast section, 110 acres registered under the name Avery in 1847, and whether there were any subsequent transfer documents. Fenwick, now genuinely curious, went back to the archive. He came back with a thin folder. Inside was a transfer document dated 1861, a sale made under circumstances that the record described only as financial necessity, and the name of the buyer was Hale. She sat with that for a moment. Then she closed the notebook and thanked Fenwick and walked out into the cold November street and stood on the courthouse steps looking across the bare winter elms of the county square, and for the first time since arriving in Millhaven, her composure showed something underneath it. Not grief exactly, and not anger, but the particular expression of a person who has found something they traveled a long way to find and is now determining, very carefully, what to do with it. She had not told Thomas yet. She had not told anyone. She walked back to the farm in the cold, arriving before noon, and found Thomas mending a fence line in the east pasture. He looked up when she came across the field and read her face the way he was beginning to learn how to do, which was carefully and without assumption. He asked if she had found what she was looking for. She said she had. She said she needed a few more days before she could explain it properly, and asked if he could trust her that long. He looked at her across the frost-stiff grass for a moment and said yes, which was the truth, and the truth of it surprised him somewhat. The days that followed had a different quality. Not uncomfortable, the opposite, actually, which was somehow more disorienting. They had found a rhythm in the house, the two of them, built from small daily consistencies, coffee before light, the particular division of morning tasks that had established itself without discussion, the hour after supper when she read and he worked through the farm ledger, and the fire in the main room hearth made the only sound. It was the kind of quiet Thomas had lived in for years without it ever feeling like anything other than absence. This quiet felt different. It had texture. It had a second person in it. He noticed things. She took her coffee black and very hot. She had an instinct for the farm's rhythms that seemed too precise for someone from eastern Pennsylvania who had never mentioned farming. She talked to the horses differently than she talked to people, more freely, with a lightness in her voice that showed up sometimes when she did not know he was close enough to hear. She read in the evenings from a slim volume she kept in her coat pocket, and when he finally saw the title from across the room, it was a book of Ohio land history from 1850 that was not the kind of thing a person picked up casually. Millhaven had not stopped watching. On Sunday at the church service they attended together, which was the first time Thomas had sat in a pew with another person in 3 years, the awareness of the congregation was almost physical, a warmth of attention pressing in from all sides that he found deeply uncomfortable and that Margaret appeared to register, process, and set aside in about 30 seconds. She sang the hymns with the same quiet clarity she brought to everything, and afterward at the church door old Mrs. Hollis shook her hand and said she had a remarkable bearing, and Margaret thanked her in a way that seemed to mean it. Walking home through the cold, Thomas asked if she was all right. She said she was. He asked if the town bothered her. She said not more than she had expected. He said that was not really an answer. She looked at him sideways with a brief, almost reluctant smile she produced occasionally that had the effect, on Thomas, of rearranging something in his chest. She said that the town's interest in her was understandable given the circumstances, but that the circumstances were about to become considerably more interesting, and she thought the town ought to pace itself. He stopped walking. She kept going for 2 steps before she stopped and turned back to look at him. She said she was almost ready to tell him everything. She said she hoped he would hear it in the right spirit. He said he would try. She nodded and turned and kept walking, and Thomas stood in the road for a moment longer, and the Ohio winter sky above him was high and white and enormous. She told him on a Wednesday evening after supper, when the fire was high and the wind outside was doing its usual business against the north wall of the house. She brought the canvas bag from the bedroom and set it on the table between them, and unwrapped the bundle he had watched her place in the desk drawer on the first night. Inside was a small collection of documents, letters tied with brown cord, a photograph in a paper sleeve, and a hand-drawn copy of the survey map he now recognized from her description of the courthouse records. She laid these out carefully, and then sat across from him and told him everything. Her grandfather, William Avery, had owned 110 acres in the northeast section of Millhaven Township. He had farmed it from 1847 until 1861, when a series of bad harvests and a loan called in at the worst possible moment had forced the sale at a price significantly below the land's value. The buyer had been a man named Robert Hale, Thomas's grandfather. The sale had been legal and documented, and there was no wrongdoing in it. She was specific about this, and specific also that she was not here to make any claim or accusation. What she was here for was something else. Her grandfather had left Ohio with his family and moved to Pennsylvania and never spoken about the farm again, not directly, not in a way that suggested comfort. But he had kept everything: the deed, the survey copy, the letters from neighbors, a photograph of the farmhouse taken the spring before the sale, which she slid across the table to Thomas now. He looked at it. The farmhouse in the photograph was his farmhouse. The maple tree in the yard had been smaller. The barn had had a different roofline. But the house was unquestionably his house. She said her grandfather had told her mother once, just once, that the land had been the only place he had ever felt entirely himself, and that leaving it had been the one event of his life he had not found a way to make peace with. Her mother had told her. And when her mother passed 18 months ago, Margaret had found the documents in the bottom of a cedar trunk and had understood, with the certainty of someone who has always known a story's shape before being told its ending, that she needed to come here. Not to reclaim anything, just to see it, to stand on the land and close a chapter that had been left open for 60 years. She stopped talking. The fire made its sound. Thomas looked at the photograph for a long time and then looked at her. He asked why she had answered his letter specifically. She said she had seen the property address in the agency listing and recognized the township name from the documents. He was quiet with that for a long moment. He said that his grandfather had mentioned the Avery purchase exactly once, in a journal entry Thomas had read years after the old man's death, and had described it as a transaction that had required a good man to do a painful thing. Then he looked at her and said she was welcome to walk every inch of this land for as long as she needed. She looked back at him, and the composure she wore like a second coat slipped, just briefly, just enough. She walked the northeast section the next morning, alone, at her own pace, in the cold that turned her breath visible and made the frozen ground ring underfoot. Thomas had marked the old property boundary for her with stakes the previous evening, working in the last of the daylight from the courthouse map, and she moved along the line of them through the frost-stiff grass with her hands in her coat pockets and her face turned out across the land. The northeast section was rolling slightly near the creek line, nothing dramatic, just the gentle variation in Ohio ground that lets water find its way. There was a stand of oak along the eastern edge that had been old already in her grandfather's time. She stood under them for a while. Thomas watched from a distance, not intrusively, from the fence line of the adjacent pasture, where he had legitimate work to do, and did it without letting himself turn around more than occasionally. He had spent the evening after her revelation sitting with the facts of it, arranging them into something he could properly understand, and what he had arrived at by morning was that the situation was more remarkable than anything he had ever been adjacent to, and that Margaret Avery was more remarkable still. She had come here carrying 60 years of her family's unfinished grief in a canvas bag and a surveying copy. She had answered a lonely man's joke of a letter because the address on the listing matched an old map from the bottom of a cedar trunk. And having arrived, having found exactly what she came for, she had told him truthfully and without accusation or demand and asked for nothing except the chance to walk the ground. When she came back across the field at noon, her cheeks were red from the cold, and her expression had the particular, settled quality of someone who has completed something that needed completing. She stopped beside him and looked back at the northeast section. She said it was good land. He said it had always been good land. She said she could see why her grandfather had loved it. Thomas looked at the field for a moment, and then said that she should know his grandfather had recorded in that same journal entry that he hoped the family who had sold the land had found solid footing somewhere else. He had thought about them. He had carried some of it, too. She looked at Thomas then with an expression he had not seen from her before, open, unguarded, and somewhere beyond the composure, and said that was the thing about land. It remembers. He nodded. They stood in the cold together looking at the oak trees on the eastern edge, and neither of them moved toward the house for a while. That afternoon, Gus came by with a question about a fence line and found two people working together in comfortable nearness in the kitchen garden, and went home and told his wife that something had changed out at the Hale farm in a way he could not quite put words to, but felt entirely certain about. The secret, when it became known, spread through Millhaven in the way that genuinely surprising truths travel, not as gossip but as something more substantial, something that required people to sit with it and reconsider their earlier, shallower opinions. It was Fenwick at the Land Records Office who started it, not from malice but from the simple inability to contain something that striking. He mentioned to his wife that a woman had come in and researched the old Avery parcel, and that the woman's name was also Avery. His wife mentioned it to Mrs. Hollis. Mrs. Hollis, who had been in Millhaven long enough to remember names from 4 decades back, sat down when she heard it and said, "Oh," and put together the rest herself. By Sunday, the congregation had the full shape of the story, or close enough, and the quality of attention directed at Margaret during the service had shifted entirely. It was no longer the sharp, suspicious curiosity of people examining someone they have not yet categorized. It was something warmer and more complicated. The attention of a community that has discovered it is connected to a stranger in ways it had not anticipated and is working out how to hold that. After the service, 3 people approached Margaret who had not spoken to her before. One of them was an elderly man named Perch who said he remembered the name Avery from his father's stories and shook her hand with both of his. Thomas stood nearby through all of this and watched the town receive Margaret and felt something he could not name precisely but recognized as relief, not for himself, but for her, because she had carried this thing quietly for a long time and the town was responding with something that resembled grace. On the walk home, she said that she had not expected it to go that way. He asked which way she had expected. She said she wasn't entirely sure, but that she had prepared for a more difficult version. He said Millhaven had its faults, but that fairness was generally one of its better qualities. She said she was glad to know that now. He said he supposed she planned to stay long enough to see more of those qualities, and the question in that sentence was not hidden, and neither of them pretended it was. She looked straight ahead at the road for 3 steps before she said she had not thought much about leaving. He said that was good to know. They walked the rest of the way in the comfortable silence that had been theirs from almost the beginning, and it carried, now, considerably more in it than it had before. December came in with a week of hard frost that locked the ground and turned the creek at the edge of the property into a still, pewter-colored line between white banks. The farm settled into its winter rhythm, slower and more interior, the days shorter and the evenings longer, the fire the center of the house in a way it was not in other seasons. Margaret had taken on the record-keeping, not because Thomas had asked her to, but because she had found the ledger on the kitchen shelf one evening and noticed 3 errors in October's grain tallies, and had corrected them silently and left it open to the right page. Thomas had discovered the corrections in the morning and sat with the open ledger for a moment before closing it and putting on his coat, and neither of them discussed it, which was somehow the best possible conversation about it. Her presence had reorganized the house in small, permanent-feeling ways. There were 2 books on the shelf that had not been there before. The kitchen window had a cloth she had made from a remnant of gray wool that cut the north draft without blocking the light. There was rosemary growing in a pot on the sill, and probably green in the middle of Ohio December, which she had started from a cutting she'd brought from Pennsylvania and which Thomas found he was oddly protective of. The letter arrived on a Thursday from the Hartwell Correspondence Agency, addressed to Thomas, noting that as the match arrangement had now exceeded 60 days, they would require either a formal declaration of intent to proceed or a notification that the arrangement was concluded for their records. Thomas set it on the table and looked at it for a considerable time. He was still looking at it when Margaret came in from the garden. She looked at the letter. He explained what it was. She sat down across from him and looked at the letter also. She said that she had been thinking about their arrangement and that she wanted to tell him something clearly, which was that whatever she had come here for originally, the thing she was here for now was different, and she wanted him to know that before he wrote back to the agency. He asked what the thing she was here for now was. She said it was this, the kitchen, the ledger, the rosemary on the sill, the way he read in the evenings with his feet toward the fire, the farm with its 260 acres and the 110 to the northeast that she now knew like the lines of her own hand. She said she recognized she was being direct to the point of being difficult. He said he had not, at any point since she arrived, found her directness difficult. She looked at him with a not quite hidden smile. He pulled the letter toward him and picked up the pen. He practiced the words in the barn because the barn was where he went when he needed to think without the pressure of walls and windows. The horses were good listeners and completely non-judgmental, which was more than he could say for the rest of Millhaven. He had been working on the sentence for the better part of a week, not because he was uncertain about the answer, but because Thomas Hale had learned early that words said in the wrong order had a way of landing differently than intended, and this was not a sentence he could afford to land wrong. The difficulty was that a simple proposal felt insufficient for something this specific. She had not arrived the way other things arrived in his life, through straightforward necessity or practical arrangement. She had arrived through a convergence of his loneliness and her history and 60 years of land that had changed hands and been grieved over and finally, somehow, pulled two people toward it from different directions. Any sentence he constructed needed to account for all of that without taking so long that she assumed he was reading from a document. He had it by Sunday. It was 4 sentences. He considered this reasonable. He said it at the kitchen table after supper, which was where the important conversations had always happened in this house, with the fire going and the rosemary on the sill and the ledger closed on the shelf where the numbers were now all correct. He said that he had written to the agency as a joke that he did not intend to be taken seriously and had been wrong about that in the best possible way. He said that she had come here for her grandfather's land and had in the process become the most essential part of his own. He said he understood if she needed more time. He said he hoped she did not. She was quiet for one breath. Just one. Then she said, "Yes, Thomas," and it was so direct and so simple and so entirely like her that he laughed, actually laughed in the kitchen with a sound that surprised him with its own existence. Then she laughed too, and the house, which had been quiet for so many years, held the sound of it and did not let go. Gus heard about the engagement the next morning because Thomas told him personally, which was the most unprompted communication Thomas had initiated with another human being in recent memory, and Gus said it was about time and meant it completely. They were married in February, in the front room of the farmhouse, because the church was cold and the front room had the fire and the rosemary and the shelf of books and the particular quality of light from the east windows in the morning that Margaret had loved since the first day, and because it seemed right to do it in the place that had already decided they belonged together before either of them had finished deciding it themselves. Gus and his wife stood as witnesses. Edna Marsh came because she had been Millhaven's quiet force of decency since before Thomas was born, and it seemed wrong not to have her present. Old Mr. Perch came because he had shaken Margaret's hand with both of his and had not stopped thinking about the Avery connection since, and because he was 81 years old and had earned the right to attend whatever interested him. It was a short ceremony, and a warm one. Afterward there was food on the kitchen table, and the front room was loud for the first time in 3 years with the specific warmth of people gathered on purpose, and Thomas stood in the middle of it with his back to the bookshelf and watched it happen to his house with an expression Gus later described to his wife as a man who has just noticed he is happy and is still slightly surprised by the fact. In the spring, when the ground thawed, Margaret planted the northeast field section with a variety of winter wheat her grandfather had favored, found through correspondence with an agricultural society in Pennsylvania that still maintains seed stocks from that era. Thomas helped her turn the first row with a good plow horse, working east to west across the old Avery land in the April light, and the soil came up dark and rich the way good Ohio soil does, smelling of iron and water, and the specific possibility that belongs only to a field that has been left fallow long enough to recover everything it was. She did not say anything while they worked. Neither did he. The land did not require commentary. It was doing what land does when people stop being careless with it, remembering slowly what it is capable of. That evening they sat on the porch in the long light of a May dusk and looked out over the northeast section, and Margaret had her notebook open but was not writing in it. Thomas had his coffee and was not drinking it. The oak trees on the eastern edge were coming into new leaf, the same oaks that had been old in her grandfather's time, and the farm stretched in all directions in the last warm light, 260 acres, plus 110 to the northeast, belonging in full now to 2 people who had arrived at it from entirely different directions and found, at the end of all that traveling, that they had somehow always been headed to the same place. The loneliest cowboy in Millhaven County sat on his porch in the May evening, and was not lonely. He had not been, if he was honest, for some time. He had simply needed someone to show up who was honest enough not to pretend the silence wasn't real, and brave enough to sit inside it with him until it became something else. Something full. Something that sounded, in the evenings, remarkably like a life.